Liberal Senator Eric Abetz has taken aim at Victoria's Deputy Chief Health Officer Annaliese van Diemen, who likened Captain Cook to COVID-19. The Senator says the comments are ill-informed, ill-timed and terribly ill-advised. And of course, other news coming out of Tasmania, the report into the coronavirus outbreak in northwest Tasmania has been handed down, with the Ruby Princess cruise ship ruled as the likely cause of the cluster. Joining me now, Tasmanian Senator Eric Abetz. Eric, thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. Now, this woman in Victoria, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, her comments on Twitter have caused a storm, quite rightly. They are a disgrace.
They are a disgrace. The comments are ugly, they're ill-informed, they're completely out of her province, and it is disappointing to see the Daniels government coming in behind this Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Any self-respecting Premier or Health Minister would have said ill-advised, inappropriate, especially as we, on the 28th of April, were able to celebrate the 250th anniversary of Captain Cook landing at Botany Bay, which was the first step towards this great Australian nation that we now have the privilege of living in. And to try to demean that history in this particular week, in this particular manner, just shows an attempt by somebody, I think, who wants to enhance her wokeness credentials rather than to have any element of common sense about her commentary, straying way out of her expertise, and one wonders why she engaged in it other than to try to get a bit of woke notoriety.
Well, Senator Abetz, that's the key here. She's a doctor. She's not a historian. And of course, you can ask Jeffrey Blaney about Captain Cook, and you know, we wouldn't have the progressive, modern country we have right now, of which she has done very well out of. I'd love to know what her salary is. And you know, when you think about Victoria, and your comments are so prescient there, she should be sacked. She'll probably be promoted. If I was the Chief Medical Officer in Victoria, I'd be worried right now.
Not only should the Chief Medical Officer be worried, but every single Victorian should be worried as to whether her mind is actually fully on the job of seeking to deal with this pandemic in as effective a manner as possible, rather than trying to make these ill-informed, woke political comments. Because the one question that these woke people will never ask, let alone answer, is, but for Captain Cook and the English settlement in Australia, what would have become of the Great South Land that we now know as Australia? As somebody who's a migrant to this country from a non-English speaking background, I had to learn English when I got here. Can I say I am very thankful that Captain Cook got here and helped through that England establishing a settlement here, because we are the envy of the world. It's a great society. Have we done things wrong in the past? Of course we have, but so has everybody else. And what really annoys me about these woke people is their capacity to look past the boulder in their own eye to define and find a little speck in other people's eyes. It really is sickening, and I think the Australian people celebrate Captain Cook, including people like myself who are migrants to this country from a non-English speaking background. We can see the benefits, and indeed it was those benefits that saw my parents bring 6 kids to Australia when they emigrated. It's a great country. It's in the world.
Yeah,
like
I think
I would invite her to
Senator,
look for another country.
Yeah, I think with a surname like Van Diemen, she shouldn't be lecturing us on early exploration. All right, let's talk about this particular report that we've seen come out today on the Tasmanian North West Health Service. Now, there's obviously credible evidence, Senator, that the Ruby Princess link to this cluster is clear. Disappointing from your perspective?
Very disappointing what happened with the Ruby Princess. I believe that the majority of deaths in Tasmania were either people that were on the Ruby Princess and came back to Tasmania, or those that had direct contact with them or somebody that had direct contact with them. So the Ruby Princess fiasco, whoever is responsible, has occasioned widespread devastation in Australia, both in relation to the death rate, regrettably, economically and socially. So I hope that the inquiry into how this occurred with the Ruby Princess really does get to the bottom of it, and those that made those unfortunate decisions, one, are brought to account, but more importantly, that we put in place procedures to ensure that this can never happen again.
There's a lot of debate at the moment, and we've got the National Cabinet meeting, of course, tomorrow. A lot of debate about easing restrictions. Tasmania has made some very, very hardline decisions around social distancing and about its borders. What sense are you getting at the moment as to when those restrictions may be lifted in Tasmania?
I'm, for one, would like to see the restrictions being eased off as quickly as possible. I think there is room for that. However, we in Tasmania do have the added difficulty of the northwest cluster, and being a relatively small state, I can fully understand why the Premier, who has been so decisive, so good in this situation, is cautious about lifting restrictions. But I would have thought potentially access back to our national parks, Mount Wellington and elsewhere, ought to be allowed, given that we know that the likelihood of infection in open spaces is very, very unlikely.
Senator Abetz, before we go, there's a story in today's Australian. The Institute of Public Affairs did some survey work where there was a majority of Australians who believe that politicians should take a pay cut and show some leadership on that particular issue, as the private sector's enduring a lot of pain and we're seeing a lot of job losses. Do you believe that politicians should take a pay cut?
I think most Australians always believe that Australian parliamentarians should have a pay cut. I, for one, wouldn't mind it, but I fully accept that I'm in a different situation. Being a widower, empty nester, I can afford it. I can understand that parliamentarians that might have a handful of kids who have their partner at home full time because they're away so much, trying to pay a house mortgage, school fees, private health insurance, wouldn't find it that easy. But that said, I fully understand that parliamentarians are paid well above the average wage, as it quite frankly ought to be. But that aside, I can understand the sentiment of the Australian people in that survey.
Senator Abetz, thank you so much for joining us tonight from Tasmania. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure, Peter.